Hello and welcome back to El Partido, yet another Spanish football podcast. But as always, we'll make sure to bring you that nostalgic twist. No Paul tonight, unfortunately. He's deciding to watch a Champions League game on a Thursday evening, which, in my opinion, is the epitome of where we are with football, unfortunately. However, I am delighted to be joined by a wonderful guest. You may know him better as Estadios de España. I know him as Chris Clements. Chris, how are you doing this evening?
I'm very well, thank you, Nick, and thank you for the invite.
Yeah, no problem at all. I know we've spoke about getting you on the podcast a few times before. I know that you had, at the time you were on holiday during the summer, so it's an absolute delight to have you on to talk about one of my favourite topics of not just Spanish football, just football in general. I love stadiums, ground hopping, and visiting all these different places. And I suppose I have to admire you for the work you've done into Estadios de España. It is an incredible source of information. I must say it's probably the most full, most comprehensive source of stadiums in Spain. When did you start creating this, and how did you get into this? You don't just fall into this, do you?
No, I think probably to start with, I think I should sort of claim neutrality. I don't actually support any Spanish football team. I've got a sort of a hand out an olive branch occasionally to a very small team from Tiva in Valencia. I think the highest they've ever got is the third tier. I'm actually a Bristol Rovers fan for my sins, and I don't know, Nick, you're probably too young to remember them playing at Eastville, which you may have seen pictures of, a real ramshackle ground. And I first went there in the 70s when I was 7 or 8 years old. And that kind of got me hooked on looking at stadiums. It really was an incredibly ramshackle mix and match of different grounds. And when the game was particularly dull, particularly with a 10-year-old who had trouble concentrating, it was somewhere where your mind would wander and you'd look around. And then that sort of graduated to things like Match of the Day and a big match. And you think, oh, okay, well, that's what Blackpool's ground looks like, or Grimsby play there. And then sort of summer holidays invariably involve visiting a stadium, and when they were abroad, that was the case. And I suppose the other big thing that got me into stadiums was the books of Simon Inglis, somebody who is from the mid 80s onwards has really been the go-to person for any knowledge and any history. And I loved the way in which he wrote those books. And I guess that's what originally started as a blog back in 2010 about the stadiums I visited. And then I realized, actually, I'm not going to write anything else now for the next 6 months. So I then started to write about the stadiums, and in particular their history and how the stadium evolved more often than not with the ups and downs of the clubs themselves. And I started that as a blog in 2010, and there's been a couple of iterations of the website since then, and the current one was set up in 2018 using a lot of the resource from the previous stuff, but I've tried to keep it as updated with the changes and both in terms of the stadiums, the clubs, and also the structure of the league as well.
Yeah, I always find it interesting, and there is a genuine buzz of excitement sometimes when you're on, scrolling through Twitter or as X as it's now known, and you see a new post. And I'm flattered and fortunate enough that our El Partido posts were tagged a couple of times during the summer for these updates. And these updates, just when you drop like 80 photos of the former San Mamés, it's just like. It leads you down a rabbit hole, and you take us on that journey with you, don't you, Chris? And I suppose I've got to ask, like, does it come in sort of like in sways, or do you get like a bit of information, or do you then sort of like just decide to dive into one particular club? What's the process? Because it's so much information to handle. I struggle to see like how it's all put together so perfectly.
Well, that's very kind. What you're looking at invariably is an article that was originally written. So if you take, for example, the San Mamés one, that was probably written in 2010, would have probably been about a third of the length that it is now. I suppose the hardest part is starting afresh. So the other element that you'll see on the website are new clubs that we've not covered before. It will be using some fantastic sources in Spain, La Futbolteca, which is the online Spanish encyclopedia of football. Football Regional Español, which has got practically every result, every playoff across all of the years, and you can drive down through town or through region or through club and the different names in which the club is done. And another great website is BD Football. So, without the internet, none of this really would have been possible. It would have required probably me to pack up home, leave the family, and live in Spain for 30 years. So it's an evolving process. Yes, new photos do come, and mistakes are made. You'll think, for example, the final match at a particular ground was in the 5th of June 1943, and then you find out when you look back and you find some more information. What I try to do is to go to I think it's about 270 pages, different, it's not necessarily different stadiums, because some pages will include 2 or 3 stadiums. For example, the early one, which is under the Camp de la Cort for Barcelona, which was their main stadium before the Camp Nou, will include the previous grounds as well. So it's an evolution. There will be new information that comes up, and I do try to go back and revisit them at least once a year, along with any new grounds. So any new teams that got promoted. I know Juventud Torremolinos got promoted at the end of last season, never appeared anywhere on the website prior to then. So you start from scratch, and that's a lot harder than having sort of you have a template, you have a lot of information, you can go in and tweak it, and you can update it.
No, well, I've got to thank you personally as well, Chris, because I also have a sister podcast called El Pozo, which is a podcast all focused on the Primera Federación, of which Juventud de Torremolinos got promoted to this season. And we had to do all 40 clubs, and we did a bit of a thread with a bit of background information, history, and obviously where they play, what's their stadium like. So your site was a massive source of information, not just for information about the stadium, though. I found myself using a lot of the information about the history of the clubs as well, and that narrative that is in there that you wouldn't glean from other sources as well. So I've got to again sort of like doff my hat to you to say that it's not just about doing facts and fictions about buildings, is it? You're telling the narrative of the story, you're telling the history of the club along with the stadium story in parallel as well, which is what I think makes your website so interesting, especially to someone who is as fanatical about Spanish football as I am, and I'm sure many of our listeners are as well.
I mean, thank you. I mean, and as I say, you could just write down all the facts, bullet point them, and you'd have the information. But again, going back to Simon Inglis's writing, he whether it was his own club Aston Villa or whether he was writing about Berwick Rangers, he developed a narrative, and he did say that invariably what you'll see is the ups and downs of a team will be reflected in the building or the dereliction of a stadium. They do tend to run hand in hand, or even moving from a stadium, either upgrading or downgrading, does tend to run with the fortunes of the football club.
No, absolutely. I think, like you say, they're both hand in hand, aren't they? And if you would humour us tonight, as you know, we are a nostalgic football podcast, so we do look back at some of those incredible older stadiums, some of them you've mentioned already, with a lot of fondness. And when you've got an expert such as yourself, I'm sure we'd like to put on a couple of those threads. The first one I wanted to talk about this evening, with it being 8 years since Atletico Madrid moved from their home at the Vicente Calderón, I just sort of wanted to get your opinion on what your thoughts around the old stadium were, and the experiences of when you've wrote about it, to say, like, we've had Miguel Pereira on the podcast, for example, and he said it was the closest thing you'll find to a South American style stadium in Spain. Is that kind of an opinion you share?
Absolutely. I mean, the stadium itself was home for what was that, 1966 through to, when did they go? 2017, I think they moved, didn't they? So you're looking at just over 50 years of again, ups and downs. But actually, the stadium was pretty much of a constant. It was very difficult to get off the ground. They were playing to the northwest of Madrid, a stadium that shared the name of the current stadium, not to be confused. It was called the Estadio Metropolitano, and had been set up, been built by the forerunner of the Madrid Metro as a sort of a sports ground and social area, and they needed a team to play there. And Madrid up to that point had been very nomadic. Atleti to that point had been very nomadic, and moved to the Metropolitano. They outgrew. It wasn't, it was a stadium that was not really suited to handling big crowds, although it could hold big crowds. Getting them in and getting them out was a problem. So they bought this stretch of land on the banks of the Rio Manzanares, which runs through the west of Madrid into the south of Madrid. And you really wouldn't plan to build a football ground there. They already knew that the soil wasn't fantastic, so it needed an awful lot of piles to be driven in to build the stadium. And there was a real big chance that the inner ring road would actually run through right against the river itself. What it did have was lots of tenements around it, and it meant that there was it was in the core of Atleti supporters in the south and the west of Madrid. And they started it in the early 60s, moved in 1966, but even then the main stand wasn't complete. The upper tier of the main stand was just scaffolding, and it wasn't until 1971 that it looked like what you would recognize, you and I would recognize, as the Vicente Calderón. And whilst I absolutely agree with Miguel, it is probably the only stadium in Europe that would pass off as an Argentinian top flight. The fervor it creates, I think. What I would say about Atleti during that time at the Calderon was that it was very much up and down, and I think if you were to have memories of some of the 90s and the early 2000s, you wouldn't actually be necessarily remembering it the way that you choose to remember it, as this fervent, boiling pot where Simone's Dogs of War sort of had these fantastic Champions League nights, and they had their marvelous runs in the Champions League as well. You did have half full stadiums and half baked ideas from Jesus Hill going on, and they did win one title. They did start off very well in the late 60s and early 70s. They won another title in 96, but within 3 years they were back in La Segunda, or they dropped to La Segunda, first time since the 1930s that they'd done that. So I suppose on any point of view, if you were living in Madrid in the 80s and 90s, you'd think, okay, that's a bit. If you look at the World Cup, for example, the stadium, I don't think, got above half full for any of the three games that were played there. So a lot to be thankful for, both the player in Diego Simeone and also the manager. And you kind of worry about Atleti when his days come to an end there.
Yeah, I think he's only a couple of weeks away from being the longest-serving manager ever in La Liga. So,
Mm,
which is a novelty nowadays, I suppose, given how quickly some other clubs go through them. And I think you're right, Chris. Like you say, especially for maybe people of my age, when we first got involved with looking at Spanish football, or you were exposed to it with things like the boys on Revista de la Liga, for example, or if you were watching Champions League football, which the crowds tend to swell for those
yeah.
kind of games, don't they? So we are probably looking at the Calderon with a bit of rose tinted glasses. Um,
Mm,
but I think the main thing that I always take away from it is when it was on song, it was a thunderous sound, wasn't it? And I think as well, I just take away some of the novelty sometimes. You did have those sort of like banking tears that are in there. You did have the parts where you think it was about to turn a corner, then it would abruptly stop, and
mm.
we all talk about the dual carriageway which went underneath the Riverside stand. It was a very unique place, which I think in many ways you would struggle to recreate if you moved anywhere. Do you know what I mean? Like it's kind of like you can have this wonderful modern stadium, but you're not going to have the quirks of the old place, are you?
No, I never saw a game out of the Calderon. I've visited and done the tour when I was in Madrid. I saw a game at the Bernabeu, but it was of its time. It was all concrete. Uh, I guess it was a stadium that, as a supporter, you would love, and as a visiting supporter or a visiting player, when they were on song, it would scare the bejesus out of you. And it was, and again, the way it was built, the steepness, particularly of the upper tiers, the closeness to the stand, wasn't. I'd say was probably accidental, or was always going to happen because of the plot of land they had was so tight to the river. But also one of the first stadiums I remember in Spain as actually having coloured seating. I mean, the main stand, even in the early 70s, had the mattress red and white stripes, and even then, before. Certainly, we saw it in the UK. The club colours picked out, and the last 20 years, 25 years of the Calderon, any aerial view was always that recreation of the athletic kit of red and white stripes and the lower tier of blue.
No, absolutely, and like you say, it's those unique things that you wish you could, dig up and take with you. And it's not to take anything away from the Metropolitano either, because this new stadium is an elite stadium. Yes, it's a bit out of the way, but in terms of providing a platform for Atleti to move forward as a force, not just in Spanish football but European football, it gives them everything, doesn't it? So, we can say a lot was lost, but there is so much that they've gained with this new ground, haven't they?
Yeah, and the reason they did move was primarily financial. They could have been an awful lot richer if it wasn't for the planning sort of stipulations that stopped what was going to be luxury apartments going up on the site of the old brewery next to the Calderon. And in the end, they managed to knock together some deal, which, because it was originally going to be the a stadium for Madrid's Olympic bid, the Metropolitano. It was actually built as an athletic stadium back in the day, and they even held the Spanish Super Cup there back in the 80s. But it was essentially an athletics track and one big stand. It was sort of known. I can't think of the Spanish for it now, but basically it looked like the hair comb that flamenco dancers used to put in their hair. It's known as the comb, this stand, and that stand is still the basis of the main stand where the cameras are, where you look out from when you're watching it on TV, is still the basis of that, and they've built the rest of it around it. So it is a regenerated stand, for want of a better phrase. And they've done a very good job. You're right, it is an elite stadium. It's a great conversion. It's helped in no small part by Atleti hitting the ground running and continuing to impress in Europe, but also winning that league title in 2020, I think it was, they won. And whilst it is out of the way, and if you're traveling, it's not the worst metro system in the world. In Europe is in Spain, but you are moving away from your fan base. What it does draw in is other fans from that northeastern side and northern sort of satellite towns of Madrid, and they've had little trouble filling it. And it is, as you say, it is an elite stadium, and deserves credit for that. And they last week I see they were awarded the Champions League again for 2027.
Yeah, which is usually like a great hallmark for any stadium to host a European final, which probably leads us quite nicely onto our next stadium, where we're going to discuss sort of like the old and new again. San Mamés, I saw that you put up 80 additional photos of this on the website the other day. I think, maybe just to jump to one of the final questions, this is the blueprint, isn't it? Sometimes when you're looking at, how to do a stadium upgrade to go from something which is so iconic to something which is even more iconic, San Mamés ticks all the boxes, doesn't it?
I think Athletic, given the drought over the years that they've suffered, they were the big team in the 1930s and again in the 40s and early 50s, and they had that remarkable 2 or 3 years in the 80s, and then this massive drought they had. But all along, they've remained true to the cantera, the fact that they will only pick Basque players. They've had many non-Basque managers over the years, but they've stuck with the Basque players. The way in which they class a Basque player is vary quite dramatically from where it was in the 50s and 60s. It's a bit more flexible than what it used to be, but essentially they've kept that. And what I did particularly like about the new stadium is that it was built so close to the original San Mamés, and they took the care to ensure that that iconic arch from the original San Mamés was dismantled, wasn't disposed of. It was never going to be incorporated in the new stadium, but they found a way of incorporating it in the B team's ground at Lezama. If you're ever, I suppose also from your other podcast with La Primera, it is littered with B teams, the Primera, the third tier of Spanish football, and they not a great deal of warmth is felt towards it. If you're going to have a B team stadium, Athletic have done a fantastic job there as well, and yeah, I think they built it at the right time as well. I mean, there wasn't a lot being built after the financial crash. They set their stall out at and around 2008, 2009, and they committed to getting it done, and they benefited from designs at the Emirates. They could see what had been done there in terms of the designs, particularly the upper and lower tiers, and also in terms of the way the stadium is clad. You've got some excellent examples from the German World Cup in 2006. Bayern Munich's stadium is what you've almost got this melding together of the Emirates and Bayern Munich Stadium, and it works so fantastically with the new San Mamés, in terms of the way it looks. I was watching the Arsenal game the other day, and it's an astonishing atmosphere, and you're so on top of the game. Far better. I mean, I did go to the original San Mamés. It was a dreadful game against Osasuna. I think it was 0-0. And whilst you were really on top of it, in fact, it wasn't the most comfortable of stadiums. And this was a stadium that was completely rebuilt mostly three-quarters of it was rebuilt for the 1982 World Cup. So it wasn't an old stadium, but they've excelled in the way in which they've built the new San Mamés, and kept their class about them athletic as well.
They do, and there's something really core about Athletic Club in Bilbao. I remember a friend of mine went to visit. I think he went to watch Baracaldo actually, Malaga against Baracaldo. But he was in Bilbao anyway. He was astonished about how every corner you turned, there was a Athletic Club flag or a shirt or a poster or even a badge on the milk. And I think where San Mamés really, really comes into its own is that from any point in the city, really, you are very close to the home of football in Bilbao. And I think it's that city centre location as well, which really serves its purpose and has helped keep its soul, I suppose. And I think that's where you see in the atmosphere, basically pick up like we did the other night when Arsenal visited, Champions League football back in the Basque Country. And it was just sensational, wasn't it? And for me, I will pin my colours in the mast, Chris. I am a Malaga fan for my sins, and Malaga were supposed to get a new stadium for the World Cup in 2030, but it's been kiboshed, and there's other new plans. If they could have had something like San Mamés, I would have been a very, very happy man.
Yeah, it's one thing that is often forgotten is that the club actually, not only did they listen to the fans and the way it was financed as well, with obviously the club putting money in, but as is the case with a lot of particularly with the municipal stadiums, and we'll come on to this when we talk about Zaragoza later on, is that there are community facilities within the stadium. There's gyms, there's meeting rooms, there's social clubs within the body, which means that it is used throughout the week. So it is part of that. But what I thought was very telling, if you look at pictures from when it opened. Well, when it opened, it was only 3 sides because they were still clearing the site of the old stadium. When they built the 4th side, it was a particularly wet winter, which is saying something in the Basque Country. I mean, it makes Wales look positively drought-ridden, but it was a particularly wet winter, and and there was very little protection for the lower tier. If you look at it, it is quite obvious that much of the roof that now isn't there. And within a matter of, I would say, 18 months, they built this new ring compression roof, which along with now modern technology, where you'll see most of the clubs now with these high stadiums and roofs now use these gantries that light and give a heat and light to the pitch. It means that that not only does keep the fans dry, but boy, does it keep the noise in it. San Mamés now it's a marvelous stadium.
It is a real echo chamber, and like I say, I think if anyone, we've seen a lot of redevelopment of estadios in Spain, and a lot of them take the inspiration from this one. I suppose the next stadium I'm going to bring up maybe has 2 questions for it, and we've called it the Mestalla question here. First one for me is I went to the Mestalla for the first time earlier this year. I went to watch them in a drab 1-1 draw with Real Valladolid, just as Carlos Corberán had come in as manager as well. So it wasn't Valencia at their pomp, but it was still iconic to go to Mestalla, and it felt like a pilgrimage more than anything to me, that I had to get there, I had to see it, especially before it goes. And I suppose maybe my first question is sort of like, what's your view on Mestalla? Is it this sort of like almost religious event to go to Valencia and to watch a game of football there?
It's a marvelous city to watch football. I mean, particularly my memories of it are probably not far off this time of year, maybe late September. Walking through the old town, having a few drinks in the bars beforehand, then going into the stadium, and then I think if you've only visited Premier League grounds or stadiums anywhere which have only been built in the last sort of 10, 15 years. What comes as a shock, both at Mestalla and until they started doing the rebuild at the Camp Nou, is that essentially you've got the bowl of which you will watch the football in, and then anything underneath it resembles sort of a derelict 1970s car park. There's nothing. The concourses have been the norm in English and German and French football for 20, 30 years now. Don't exist in any shape or form like that at Mestalla, nor did they at the Camp Nou. That's going to be rectified later rather than sooner. But it is a bit of a shock to the system. But for the purist, it was, and I think I said this in my article, it was built at a time when going to watch a football match was just that. You went to watch a football match. You weren't there to be entertained by anything else other than the football, and you had the social interaction with your friends. So you didn't necessarily need, your frothy macchiatos or whatever you wish to take. So it is a bit of a shock to the system, but in that walk from through the old town, just across the old river, what was is now parkland, into Mestalla is on a late summer's evening or early autumn evening, is a joy, and it is. I think it might have actually just been surpassed by the main stand at Everton's. I'll call it Bramley Docks. I've forgotten what it's called, what the proper name is, or the official name is. That is now, I think, the steepest seated area in Europe, in top flight European football. But the Mestalla is this sort of concrete slab after concrete slab, and then this roof, which was built in the early 50s, which seems to defy gravity. Is like a really old. If you see footage from, say, something, I don't know, Stamford Bridge or the old Wembley back in the 1930s, as if they've got that roof and then just knocked out all the supports. It's a cantilever roof, but God knows how it still stands up and what have you. So it is, I get the pilgrimage bit, and I guess the situation is that Valencia can't stay there and be a top half team in the Primera. That's no longer viable. I think what you need to remember is that it was 2003, their last Champions League appearance in the final. They were I think they won the UEFA Cup the year after, and they were the number one ranked team in Europe, which then led to the decision to move on, and we need to build this new stadium, which we're still waiting for.
Yeah, it's a bit of a bad joke, really, sometimes, isn't it, when we talk about the new Mestalla? Spades went into the ground back in 2007, I think it was, and then ever since the spades were taken back out of it back in 2009, it's just laid dormant for the best part of 15 years. Obviously, that's been revitalized in the last 12 months with the 2030 World Cup on the horizon. But obviously, as you speak about as well, the limitations that an old stadium can have, no matter how nostalgic or how much in love you are with the place, it does limit you financially in a world where quickly money is becoming what you need. So the move to the new Mestalla, I suppose it has to happen, or does it, Chris? Where do you fall on this?
I mean, it has to happen. Whether it will happen, and I think we're almost at a stage where there's a game of who blinks first between the club and the World Cup organising committee. So, for anybody who isn't aware, the 2030 World Cup is taking place in Morocco, Spain, Portugal, and at FIFA's whim, they've also decided to chuck a couple of stadiums in South America to mark the centenary. So Spain were allocated 10 spots, and Valencia, understandably at the time when they made the decision, because it was, you know, this almost Colosseum-like structure, it hadn't had any work on it for 15 years, wasn't selected, and everybody seemed to think that was it. You've also got the owner Lim is, you know, he's an owner in absence, and the club has suffered as a result of that. Any of the promises and the statements that he's made about the new Mestalla haven't borne any fruit whatsoever. And yes, if to go back to what I said a moment ago, if Valencia are to get back even close to where they were in the 1950s, again in they were very good side in the 60s as well, and definitely in the 90s and early 2000s, where they had that fantastic, beautifully flowing football played by the team under Rafa Benitez and other coaches, but you know, Benitez was the got the last league championship whilst they were there, and they won the UEFA Cup whilst he was there as well. They're not going to do it at the Mestalla. I mean, if anybody comes, the only way they're going to do it is with money, and if anybody comes in with money, there isn't really the scope to build anything bigger than 45,000 on the site of the Mestalla. You know, if you think it was to get any more than that, if you think it's steep now, to get any more than that, it'd have to be a lot steeper. So, you know, if somebody's going to come in with money for the club and commit to improving the stadium, it's not going to be the Mestalla. It will either be the new Mestalla or another site. Other than that, they are going to gradually, you know, become almost maybe even an elevator team. I hesitate to say it, but the revenue that are being generated by teams a quarter of their size will soon outstrip what they get at the Mestalla. There's a problem with the new Mestalla, as you say, is, you know, work stopped in 2009. They've made this commitment. They've used the CVC loan money, and they've also entered into a loan which will fund about 360 million relaunch of the new Mestalla. And they said that they're looking to have it completed by the start of the 27-28 season. Well, they supposedly have this sort of big social media tweets and TikTok videos of them going back into the new Mestalla and breaking the ground again. Actually, really, all they've done in 9 months is really just remove a few weeds and fill in a couple of gaps that were that nature has created in that time. So they're not going to be in by the 27-28 season. They're not going to be able to get what they are. And the sad thing about it is that with each of the iterations of the stadium, from what was the Reed Fenwick design for which was the originally went with, was an outstanding stadium. It was, you know, metal clad, and the roof was split with light coming through. It was an astonishing. What you're getting now and what they're proposing for the 27-28 season, and hopefully what they want for the World Cup, isn't actually any better than the stadiums that we would have seen in Germany in 2006. I mean, it is essentially, it's going to have a canvas ring, a dual ring roof on it, not dissimilar to what you've got at the Metropolitana and La Couture, but it's a significant downgrade, and each one of the new plans that come out have become less and less attractive a stadium. But what I think they're at now is that Lim doesn't want to put any more money into it. They've got this money on loan from the bank and the CVC agreement with La Liga. But you get the impression, do they actually want to start work on that and spend that money if they're not going to get a World Cup? And the World Cup committee, are they in a position that says, well, we're not going to give them an invite if they don't start work on the stadium? And it's almost this sort of Mexican standoff, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, it does, and I think that's where Malaga were at one point as well. And that's why ultimately the decision has gone to not proceed, given ultimately it was the future of the club which was up for stake. I imagine that Valencia don't have that trouble. One side that has committed to, we are having the World Cup here, as you mentioned before, Zaragoza. La Romareda is such a iconic stadium, and for everyone who I'm sure is definitely aware, those nets, they are an institution in themselves, aren't they, Chris? And but they've gone for it. They've decided that they want to bring the World Cup to Zaragoza. They have this iconic stadium, but realised that it was nowhere near the capacity, or the facilities were nowhere near suitable enough to host it. So they've demolished the whole thing. They've relocated to a temporary stadium on the outskirts of town in what is essentially a lot of scaffolding. If you ever went to Bloomfield Road once upon a time, Chris, it's very similar to the away stand that we used to have there at one point. But they've gone for it. And I suppose the question I have for yourself on this, is this the right decision for Real Zaragoza and the city?
Time will tell. I think from Real Zaragoza's perspective, the actual risk is not that great, or it comes from another area, shall we say, with Real Zaragoza. So as you say, the La Romareda was late 50s, 57, was built, and at the time was the most modern and exciting stadium, or different rather than have the these big balls that Sevilla and Real Madrid and Barcelona had built. They'd gone along very much an Estadio Inglés, the four sides, no corner stands. That was it. And it was, it was the catalyst to an extremely successful Real Zaragoza side in the 1960s. Fair Cup wins. They won. I think they won the Copa del Rey 4, maybe 5 times in the 60s, and they were a mainstay, maybe bar one season, right the way through to the end of the 20th century. So it was a fantastic move for them. And as you say, it was this iconic stadium with these goal nets. They got these lovely ring. It used to have a lovely ring of palcos, which are very much rudimentary executive boxes from way back, where the glitterati of the city would keep themselves away from the oi polloi. But literally, it would be a little bit of fencing and a gate, and that would be it. But it had this ring of palcos that ran all the way around the stadium. But I don't think probably the last time any decent money was spent on it was when the Olympics, they held some matches for the Olympics in 1992. They've thrown a few seats in there, but I don't think you've even renewed the seats in the last 20 years at La Romareda. So it was very much going back to the point of, reflecting that how our club was. If you look at Real Zaragoza since they dropped out of La Primera, stadium has kind of followed suit and looked very dog-eared. What I say is not a massive risk for them is that they were the guys that own Inter Miami, or two of the brothers that have invested into Miami, bought into Real Zaragoza 2 or 3 years ago, cleared the debt, which was over 60 million, and we've got them back on an even footing financially. La Romareda is a municipal stadium, like La Rosaleda in Malaga. So this might be a bit of an unusual concept to followers of English football or other football, where they kind of say, well, the club owns the stadium, or the owner owns the stadium. What's going on here? There are an awful lot, not necessarily the big guys, but there are an awful lot of reasonably big and medium-sized clubs, and certainly as you go down the ladder, practically very few clubs that don't own their stadium. It's a municipal asset. And what's been done with regard to the World Cup financing of the stadium financing for the World Cup is that the city of Zaragoza and the regional Aragonese government have committed the bulk of the funds. And even when I think the original fee, the original sum was about 140 million, and Zaragoza said they put up 6 million of it. So the financial risk is very small. Now that has gone up to nearly 170 million, but that increase is still being picked up by the regional government and the city government, city council. Which at a time, which I think is one of the reasons with Malaga, you're certainly getting questions being asked with Anoeta in San Sebastian, and also with Riazor in A Coruña, is one, do we really need a big stadium? And two, is it the right thing to be doing with ahead of things such as health, education, general welfare, roads? Should we be actually throwing extra money into a stadium which isn't going to be filled? If you're going to put an extra tier on Riazor and take it up to 45,000, what's the point of that? It's a waste of public resources. They've not done that in Zaragoza. Now, what your view on that is, whether it's a good thing or not, what it does come back to is actually the risk for Real Zaragoza is relatively small so far as the stadium is concerned. What they're near, the concern that they do have is that by moving out of La Romareda for 2 years, they've already had to fork out 14-15 million on this temporary stadium. They've got naming rights, but that's only bringing in about $1 million a year. The initial impact from the new owners seems to have eased a little. They're not putting the same sort of money in, and I think the main issue for Real Zaragoza is not so much the new financing the new stadium, but it's actually staying in La Segunda, staying in touch once they do have access to the stadium and the bigger crowds and the match day revenue and the attention that they got a launch pad to get back into La Primera. That, I think, is a bigger concern than the actual financial cost of the stadium. But what I would say is that got La Romareda ahead of the likes of Vigo, ahead of Valencia with the new Mestalla, ahead of Murcia with the Nueva Condomina in terms of the picking list. The city of Zaragoza and the club and the regional government committed, and they hadn't seen that in Vigo, in Valencia, or in Murcia.
Yeah, it seems to have definitely got them the basically a nailed on spot now, isn't it, for them? And I think that is a benefit to Zaragoza as well, and a benefit to the people who are going to watch the World Cup, because Zaragoza is a beautiful city, but not often one that people make as a destination. So I think they'll definitely benefit that way. And I 100% agree with you, Chris, that the main task for everyone at Real Zaragoza at the moment is, how do we stop falling down the well? How do we avoid El Pozo? And, me talking about them for an entire season on my sister podcast, which I'm sure they definitely don't want. And but my co-host is a Real Zaragoza fan, so maybe he will. So we're not too sure about that one. I suppose
is that Liam?
It is Liam Bambridge. Yes, he joins me. So he obviously is the Spanish Segunda podcast host, but he also joins me down the well once a week to talk about all the the fantastic teams that are down there too. And I'm, like I said,
he's a great guy, Liam.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah. Like I say, for when I first put the thought out about doing a podcast on the third tier Spanish football, a few people thought I was mad, but Liam was there straight away saying, I'm in. I love this. And he's got a real appetite for all things Spanish football and Real Zaragoza as well. So I do hope things do turn around on the pitch and he gets to visit this wonderful new stadium in the future. I suppose we best finish with the last 10 minutes, maybe speaking about the elephants in the room, maybe is how we discuss it. We've got two massive upgrades that we've had in the last few years, and these are for the top, two, whether we like it or not, top two biggest clubs in Spain. The Santiago Bernabeu and the will it be the new Camp Nou, or I suppose it'll be the Spotify Camp Nou when it's finally completed. But I suppose I just wanted to take your interpretation of, have they done the right thing by making these upgrades and keeping their stadiums where they are, or is this just purely financial muscle flexing from these clubs in order to exploit, all the benefits of having a modernized stadium in modern football, really?
I'd say quite possibly with regard to Real Madrid, it is, a degree. I mean, the Bernabeu has always been about posturing for Real Madrid. If you look back when it was built in 1947, they were a run-of-the-mill mid-table club that had won a couple of Copa del Reys, and but certainly, to quell any of the ongoing narrative that they were Franco's team and potentially upset half of Spain by trying to dismiss it. They won practically nothing in the first sort of 15 to 20 years of Franco. And what you would say is actually, in the end, it was Franco's team. It was Franco who actually piggybacked on the back of Real Madrid doing so well in Europe. It was the foresight of Santiago Bernabeu to say, we are going to buy this land on the most prestigious thoroughfare through Madrid, and we are going to build this stadium that will hold 120,000 people. And he committed to it, and that changed the shape of the club ever going forward. And again, to use the narrative that as Real Madrid hoarded their trophies, as the club in the 90s and the 2000s got back on the bandwagon with regard to the European Cup or the Champions League, as it was then you start to see the Bernabeu change. There's a bit I do on the website about the 7 ages of the Bernabeu, and there's a photograph on there, if you go on the website, that will show the 7 very distinct phases of how the Bernabeu has changed over the years. And this is about, Real Madrid's statement is about having the best stadium, the most iconic looking stadium, if not in the world, certainly in European football. And I don't think they're terribly far off of pulling it off. And, in the same way that fate with the financial crisis, if Valencia had started work on the new Mestalla a year, even 18 months prior to when they did, that stadium would have been near completion when the financial crisis came. They would have already sold the land on the Mestalla, and they would be playing in a new stadium. And the Bernabeu, you look at all the problems that are going on with the Camp Nou's redevelopment and the issues and the delays. Unbelievably, a stroke of luck for Real Madrid was COVID-19. It meant that he could move out of the stadium, and actually, rather than what we've seen with a lot of these prolonged and protracted stadium builds, they get diluted and watered down in terms of what they're going to look like. They actually up the ante. If you look at the plans from 2013, when this sort of it's like a George Foreman steak grill of a stadium was sort of a thing. Oh, okay, well, I'm not too sure about that. All of that amount of money for hardly any additional seats. What it did mean they could do is they could have a retractor. I mean, that COVID meant they could actually get out of the stadium. They could put the mechanism in for the retractable pitch. They could, albeit it ended up getting delayed because of the cost of steel going through the roof, and with the Ukraine war and everything else, I mean, they get this new steel manufacturers on board, but that 360-degree scoreboard wasn't even thought of in relation to that. The only thing I say they haven't really delivered on is the actual retractable roof bit. What was going to look like almost seamless with the metal facade actually looks a bit like me putting a blanket up over the garden when it's too sunny. It's not quite there, but it is a fantastic stadium, and they continue to develop. They have their concerts. They've got problems with soundproofing. They'll solve that. They will get to that point. But then they get the NFL, and then they find out that the NFL minimum requirements for particularly the end zone is too long for the stadium. So they spent the summer taking 3 tiers of terracing out at each end, 3 tiers of seat, replacing them almost seamlessly with retractable seats, so that when the NFL comes for this one game of the season to the Bernabeu, out come those seats, and then the artificial surface will be laid on that, or they may be playing on the grass pitch. I don't know. I can't remember now. So this is an example of their weight, their foresight, their luck. Let's not beat around the bush. They were able to play behind closed doors, and at the B Stadium, when they dug holes and put a subterranean tunnel in and everything else. There's a wonderful National Geographic program from about a year ago where they explain how all this came together. If you can look it up on, and I think they probably show it on National Geographic once a month. They seem to show every other program on there once a month. So that will give you the idea. And it's a very different set of circumstances from what's happened with the Camp Nou.
Yeah, no, I think I can always sum up my experience of the Bernabeu when they announced that they were building a sushi restaurant in it, and I said that's where football is nowadays. But they are making themselves, I suppose, flexible to any situation and appeal to anybody, don't they? And ultimately, when it comes down to the football and having the best facilities for the players, that is still the core value for Real Madrid when it comes to that stadium as well. It is, as you say, the Camp Nou is slightly different, and I suppose what you described as a lot of the opportunities for Real Madrid seemingly has been the opposite for Barcelona so far, such to the extent that they are playing 2 or 3 games at the Estadio Johan Cruyff, and which on the face of it is just ridiculous that a club the size of Barcelona is literally playing their league games at their training ground, which I think is a capacity of about 6,000.
Yeah,
they've really not had the same stroke of luck, have they?
They haven't. They've made some pretty poor decisions over the years as well in relation to this. Well, no, well, let me qualify that. The first plans to redevelop the site, I mean, there was a redevelopment, obviously, for the 82 World Cup where they put the upper tier on. And then for the 92 Olympics in Barcelona, they lowered the pitch. So that was the last, apart from sort of rearranging the seats, and I think they made changes to the commentary positions and camera positions. That was essentially all the work that had been done at the stadium since 1992. First plans to make a proper redevelopment of the site started in the mid-2000s, and in early 2007 there was a Norman Foster design. You can still look it up online. It's an astonishing looking stadium. Would be funded by the sale of land that the mini Estadi stood on, and some of the other land within the complex, and would increase the capacity to 106,000, all be under a roof. What was very, again, learning from what they'd seen in the 2006 World Cup in Germany, it was an exterior that lit up that you do now see it, the new San Mames. everything was in place, and then it was halted on the eve, quite literally the eve of the project commencing in 2009, partly down to the financial crisis, which, when you look at the cost, which had was coming in, believe it or not, at 250 million pounds for 106,000 stadium, that may have gone up by 2009, but not dramatically. And then the focus of the club, again, if you're winning, I get why they made those decisions, but all along they kept that team together. What did they win? 4 Champions League. Well, if you don't include the 2005, they only won 3 only won 3 Champions Leagues. They were winning the league, but they still had a to and fro with Real Madrid during this period of time. But they kept that iconic team together, and let's not beat around the bush. They played that iconic team very, very well. They were some then some incredibly poor decisions in the transfer market, and everything turned away from what they weren't really looking at the inadequacies of the Camp Nou. The 2014, they then changed those plans. And then it was a scale back. And then even if you look at when they finally did get going in what was that, 2021, it was another scale back from the 2014 plans. So what you've got with the Bernabeu stadium that has stayed pretty true to the original plan, and in fact enhanced it, what you've seen with many of the stadiums, possible exception of the new San Mamés, is actually, as time has gone on, an inevitable dilution of what they were looking to achieve. And I did get, by being neutral and by being, not showing any partisan favour for any big club, I don't get a lot of grief from Twitter. I try and deliberately avoid any sort of controversial comments. But I remember I did get with one particular tweet when I sort of raised my eyebrows and said, "There's no way they're going to be able to do this, because when they were moved out, they were only going to spend a year up at Montjuic." And I said, "There's no way they're going to be able to get back in a year." And here we are now, 2 years on. And there's talk today that it's unlikely that there's every chance they won't be back in until the new year. And it will be a lesser stadium. It will be less than what they were looking at, even before they started. The roof is considerably different from what they were doing. A lot of the facilities, the media facilities around the stadium have been downgraded, because the cost is going through a roof at a time where you've got the club having to choose which players they register and which ones they don't. It's a sad state of affairs, but credit to them, they still managed to keep winning the league title during this period of time. And you could argue, apart from a fantastic Paris Saint-Germain side last season, they may well have won the Champions League. The downside of that, of course, is that from the Primera, with all of the youth team and going up, and the B team going up to many of the B team going up to the first team, the Barcelona Athletic Barcelona Athletic, as they are now, fell from the 3rd to the 4th tier at the end of last season.
Oh yeah, well we're not too sad to see that happen, though. To be fair, so
in the 3rd tier, you've got to put a limit on the number of B teams in there, I think.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. If we could do without them, I would do. But I understand. It's a lot more tolerated in actually in Spain than it is in my house, for example. But I think first of all, you're right to be vindicated. And I do hope you feel slightly vindicated by your thought processes there to that particular person who seemingly called you out on it.
It's a war of that. I mean, it was as plain as your nose in your face. There was no way they were ever going to do that in a year. Well, you can see they haven't done it in 2 years yet, so we will see. But for the sake of the club, and competition. They won't like to say it, but it's the same wherever you are. You do need your rival, and Real Madrid are stronger as a result of Barcelona, and the same applies to Barcelona with Real Madrid. They need a strong rival, and Barcelona have come pretty close to and done an amazing job with their youth team, but have come pretty close to on a number of occasions in recent years to peering over the abyss, shall we say.
Yeah, definitely, and that'd be sort of my final worry with Barcelona and this new stadium and just where football is on a trajectory to at the moment. In order for them to be competitive with the likes of Real Madrid, is that they've had to sacrifice a part themselves to do that. And would you get the same atmosphere in this new Spotify Camp Nou compared to the Camp Nou of old? And I certainly don't think we will, but we will, like you say, see a more competitive and hopefully a more financially stable Barcelona in the future. Chris, I thank you so much for joining me. I've pinched an hour of your time this evening. I've got one final question. If there is any stadium in Spain, from your extensive portfolio on your website, which one would you say everyone has to visit at least once?
Gosh, I'm probably one of the worst people, because I can see good and love any ramshackle stadium or any massive 70,000 stadium. I'm not a very good critic, I got to say. If I were to say, well, I do get this asked quite regularly, and if I were to go back, it's probably changed year in, year out. I know the last time I was asked this a year or so ago, I did say, if you can get to see a Asturian derby at Sporting Gijón's El Molino, then you should. I do think it's one of these bits and pieces stadiums that's been put together, evolved over time. It's one of these strange things they've got about it, in Spain. They do like the oldest and the first that have done this, and they cling on to this, that they are the oldest stadium in Spain. It's a bit of a was it Trigger's broom or Theseus's paradox? None of it exists anymore from where you were. And the other flaw in Sporting Gijón's argument is that they up until 1921 they did play all around that area in what was known, I think it's the Isla Catalítica. I can't remember what the park is, but there's a park around El Molino. So they didn't actually, there's argument that they didn't actually play on that site as where the pitch is. But if you're going to go there, it's a great stadium, great atmosphere. And if you're lucky enough to watch an Asturian derby, I would recommend that one.
I think that is absolutely a perfect answer to end this podcast on. Chris, you've been absolutely amazing. That has been one of the most informative and brilliant recordings I've done on this podcast. I thank you so much for your time and for joining me.
No problem at all. And thank you for the invite again.
No worries. And I thank you, everybody at home, as well, for listening to this podcast. If you have enjoyed it, and, I doubt this is the case, but if you're not too sure of who Chris is and what we've been talking about, do go follow Estadios de España online and check out his website. It is an incredible read and an incredible piece of work that you can only just admire, and I certainly do, and it's been a great source of information for me. Go and like and subscribe all of our stuff on social medias as well. We've got some more fantastic episodes coming out very, very soon, and a interesting new project which is going to appear on our Patreon. I'll give you a little bit of a clue. It's a real page turner, but less than said that for now. Thanks again, Chris. We'll speak to you again very, very soon, and thank you to everyone at home. We'll see you then. Hasta luego.